James Michaels is a Métis Cree bentwood box maker who lives in Burnaby, British Columbia. He learned about being Indigenous later in life through developing his craft, which is a Northwest Coast art form of bent and steamed cedar boxes. He's become welcome into the Vancouver Indigenous arts community, and this has really strengthened who he is as an Indigenous person. Denise Sparrow is a Musqueam First Nation member, owner of Salish and Catering, who provides high-level catering to both Indigenous and non-Indigenous clients. She hires and mentors family members and other people from her community. She sources local seafood from First Nations fishermen, and she gives preferential pricing to Indigenous customers who might not be able to afford the quality of catering she provides. Denise is a perfect example of running a business in a uniquely Indigenous way. There are concerns that entrepreneurship could erode Indigenous identity. What effects does entrepreneurship have on Indigenous people's identity? Also, some Indigenous people say that they run their business in an Indigenous way. How do they do this? This is very important because people really want to see Indigenous peoples run their businesses in ways that reflect their cultures, identities, and communities. My SSHRC-sponsored research explores these questions by interviewing 90 Indigenous entrepreneurs in Canada and Australia. Through these interviews, I found that most Indigenous entrepreneurs feel they've strengthened who they are through entrepreneurship. James really epitomizes one of the cycles that developed through my research, which is an opportunity, knowledge, confidence cycle. In that through his business, he found out about his Indigenous identity and he's increased his knowledge and confidence in being Indigenous. Denise really epitomizes the responsibility and pride cycle, where people feel responsibility to give back to Indigenous peoples through their business. And if acted upon, the business can create pride, which can strengthen how people understand themselves as Indigenous peoples. So there were several differences between Australia and Canada. In Australia, there's programs for people to buy Indigenous. So companies will sign on to buy from Indigenous entrepreneurs. This both creates a lot of entrepreneurial opportunities for Indigenous peoples, as well as some concerns around being a token business just to fulfill the procurement policies of big companies. So the third cycle is a legitimacy and status cycle, and this is only associated with Australian interviewees. In this cycle, being Indigenous provides legitimacy in terms of being an authentic person to provide Indigenous products and services. And if acted upon in the business, this can either increase status in the Indigenous community or reduce status. Another difference between Canada and Australia is that in Canada, there was a less devastating process of colonization, which means there's more culture for Indigenous entrepreneurs to leverage and reference in their business. Where in Australia, colonization was more brutal and devastating, which means there's less cultural resources for people to incorporate into their business. So the fourth cycle is a cultural intelligence and discipline cycle, where Indigenous identity provides a sensitivity to other Indigenous cultures, if acted on in the business, can create feelings of discipline to important Indigenous traditions and practices. This cycle is only associated with Canadian interviewees, primarily due to there being more cultural resources in Canada to leverage due to a less impactful experience of colonialism. So this research has profound implications for Canadians and Australians. Most notably, it dispels the mistaken belief that being an entrepreneur will force Indigenous peoples to assimilate. Indigenous peoples need not assimilate to be entrepreneurs and can instead strengthen who they are through engagement in entrepreneurship. Also, Indigenous peoples run their businesses in ways they suggest are uniquely Indigenous. My hope is that this work will contribute both to governments and organizations who spark or support Indigenous entrepreneurship, as well as for Indigenous entrepreneurs to further understand how their business can support identity and how they can incorporate their identity into their business. There's a lot of room for entrepreneurship to become a more prominent vehicle for Indigenous peoples to make a living and make things better for their community.